Welcome to our next webinar, To ID or Not to ID. We're going to be going through some introductory information into how to tell plants and animals apart. So my name is Alexa and I'm here with my coworker Jamie, and we have a really exciting presentation for you all today. Okay, so I'm located here in the Nature House, and the Nature House is located in Esquimalt Gorge Park. So the Esquimalt Gorge Park has had a vastly changing and really diverse history through time. The park is part of the traditional and unceded territories of the Lukungan-speaking peoples, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. So they, with other First Nations groups, such as the Wasanich and Suk peoples, have historical and current relationships with the land that continue to this day. So prior to European settlement, the Lukungan peoples used Gorge Waterway for fishing, hunting, and travel. So the Gorge Waterway is this area here shown in this image where the Nature House and Esquimalt Gorge Park is. Gorge Waterway was referred to as Kemosak. So here's a link to learn more about the Lukungan-speaking peoples, their history, their culture, and the important work that they do today.
Yeah, so if you haven't heard of it before, GWAS stands for the Gorge Waterway Action Society. It's a charity organization that's focused on education and environmental stewardship in and around the Gorge Waterway. What is species identification? Can anyone tell us what species identification is? Okay, so yeah, species identification. It's when you want to figure out what a species is, and then you can determine a bit more about them. So who they're related to, when they evolved, and what makes them unique as a species. So some species identifications can be done by just someone in their own backyard. A lot of species might look alike, and the world has about 8.7 million different species. We've found an estimated about 1/5 of this amount. So many look super alike in their biology and their evolution, or they're in remote locations like super deep in the ocean where we've never gotten to.
So how do we even begin to tell species apart? There are so many animals that may look alike to us. So scientists have created a dichotomous key. It's a big word, so if you can't pronounce it, that's okay. We'll pronounce it for you. A dichotomous key is a useful tool for scientists or anyone else like you or me to identify a plant or animal based on things that we can observe on the animal or the plant. Each step of the dichotomous key has two selections, and each selection leads us to knowing, to further knowing who the species or what the organism is. So most dichotomous keys are a lot more complicated, but this is a really good example of a really simple dichotomous key. I'm going to ask everyone, what is your favorite animal or plant? So we're going to look at these through some of these major groups, three major groups. So most of us know plants, animals, and some of us may know about fungi. So fungi is made up of a bunch of different little creatures, but some of them aren't even that little. Some of them are just mushrooms. So we belong to one of these groups. We belong to the animal kingdom. And the plants make up all of our habitats, our beautiful forests, our meadows, our prairies, our riverbanks. So it's all of these groups are very large. In every form of life, there are these tiny compartments that make up each being, and these are called cells. You have cells, I have cells, fungi have cells, plants have cells, other animals have cells, we all have cells. I'm sure we all know many plants. We can see them in grasses, trees, shrubs, flowers, herbs, grains, and many other kinds. So plants actually use energy from the sun. Some of you probably have heard the term photosynthesis before. This means that plants can gather their own food from the sun and from water, and they can create energy. So in plants, those cells that we talked about, they're square, whereas in animal cells, these are round. Fungi is also an interesting group. Some of us like to eat fungi, but of course you have to be very careful because some fungi is poisonous. Different types of fungi are molds, mushrooms, yeasts. So it can be used in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes it's really harmful. It can cause disease or it can cause issues with buildings or farmers' crops. But sometimes we really like to use it. So in yeasts, we use that to make bread. Blue cheese has natural mold in it. Animals, I'm sure they're very familiar to all of us. They're very diverse. Animals can be divided into many groups that we're going to discuss. To be an animal, you have to be a living organism, of course. You have to be made up of more than one cell. So many of those little cells we talked about, you have to have lots of them, and they have to be different. So you have to have different types of cells.
So how do you start to classify all this big variety of animals in the world? So they're grouped based on their evolutionary history. So it's kind of how they came into being. For example, a shark might look kind of like a dolphin, but a dolphin is actually more related to a human than it is to a fish. So our most important first step in determining what animal we're looking at is determining the difference between what's a vertebrate and what's an invertebrate. So to solve that question, it's one of the easiest questions we're going to get today. So a vertebrate is just a creature that has a backbone, and an invertebrate is one that doesn't have one. So now we're going to get you to pick your favorite group of creatures.
This is our first question in our dichotomous key. Does your creature, what do you think? Does your creature have a backbone or does it not have a backbone? Let's get a little bit more specific. So if the animal that you chose does not have a backbone, look to the left. If your animal does have a backbone, look to the right. The next question for each of you, for those that picked no backbone, now you have to think about, does it have 6 legs? If it has less than 6 legs, if it has more than 6 legs, or if it has no legs, then you're going to say no. If you look on the right, for the backbone creatures, I'm going to ask you if your animal lays eggs. So think about yes or no if you think your animal lays eggs. Okay, so now we have some more information. If you said yes to your creature having 6 legs, then you probably have an insect. Congratulations. There are over 1 million or more types of insects. So certainly we cannot cover all of our insects today. For those of you that had the backbone creatures, we're going to go back to the eggs. So if your animal does not have eggs, does not lay eggs, you probably have a mammal. But some of you are not done yet. So if your creature does lay eggs, we have to keep going. So last question, for those that said yes to the last question, meaning you have an egg layer, the next question is, does your animal have wings? If your animal has wings, then you probably have a bird. Congratulations. For those of you whose animals do not have wings, who's not a bird, we have to keep going. We have a few more questions for you. Okay, if you said that your animal does not have wings, we have another question for you. Does your animal live in water? So think about it really deeply, yes or no. For both yes and no, if your animal lives in water or not, we're going to keep going together. So if you answered no to your animal living in water, you probably have a reptile. Congratulations. This group is over 350 million years old. So reptiles have been here a very long time. Think about the dinosaurs. For those of you that do not have a reptile, we have one more question. If your animal lives in the water, can it walk on land? So we have 2 types of creatures on this slide. If you say yes, your animal does live in the water and it walks on land, then you probably have an amphibian. Amphibians are a lot like reptiles, but they do have a few differences. For those of you that said your animal can't walk on land, it's stuck in the water its whole life, then you probably have a fish, because when we think of fish, they swim. They swim in lakes, they swim in rivers, they swim in oceans. But if you don't feel like you found your creature, that's okay, because we're going to talk about some other animals that you might have. So we're going to discuss another category that has a lot of animals in it, but can be very complicated. Okay, so take a look at our dichotomous key. This is a section of our animal key. And this is part of our question that you probably remember earlier. So we're talking about animals without a backbone. Does your animal have 6 legs? So some of you answered yes, and you got an insect, but some of you might have answered no. So if you answered no, what kind of creatures could be in this group? There are many, many groups that of no backbone animals that are not insects. There's no one group. It's not simple. So we're going to talk about some aquatic invertebrates. So this means no backbone animals that live in the water. They can live in rivers, they can live in lakes, they can live in the ocean. So this does not include all the groups that there are, but I have chosen some of my favorites and some of our famous groups that some of you might know. Let's start with mollusks. Mollusks is a big name used to describe creatures like octopuses, squid, shellfish, sea snails, clams, and other shellfish. Okay, our next group, two very big words. They're called cnidarians and ctenophores, but you don't have to remember those words. We're just going to call them jellies. That's a really good way to just describe them because they are just a lot like jelly. These creatures have no bones, no complex brains, and they have arms or tentacles that can sting. So if you think of a jellyfish or an anemone, so our next group, arthropods. This is a very big group. These creatures are also related to land insects. Land insects are also arthropods. And one of everyone's favorite groups, echinoderms. These animals are things like sea stars and sea urchins. So, some of you might be walking around the beach and saying, a lot of these creatures look the same. How am I supposed to tell them apart? They all look the same. So some of these shellfish or creatures with shells in the water can look really similar to each other. There are other kinds of shelled animals that aren't on this picture, but we'll go through some of the most common. We have mussels on our left side. Mussels are often blue, black, or gray. They are bivalves, meaning they have two shells. Their shells are longer than they are wide, and they are rounded at the top. Oysters are a lot like mussels because they often remain stuck to their homes for a long time. Their shells are irregular and longer than they are wide. You can see how many bumps and ridges are on this oyster shell. Over here, we have a cockle. So a cockle is actually a type of clam. That's why it looks so similar to this other clam we have here. So their shapes almost look like a rounded triangle. Not all clams have this shape, but a lot of them do. So it's usually a good sign that you have a clam. Next, we have a scallop. Scallops have wide, rounded shells, and the first thing you want to look for is this little rectangle at the bottom of their shell. Lastly, we're going to talk about the abalone and the limpet. The abalone is unique because it has all these little holes along its shell ridge, and the limpet is unique because when you look at it from the top, it looks like a big oval.
Oh yeah, we got a ton of cool invertebrates that live in the sea, but there's also a bunch that live on land too. So one that you might have seen, they're called gastropods, which means something basically like mouth foot, because that's pretty much their only two parts. They've got a mouth, and then they've got this long body that's basically their foot that they use to travel around. And those are all, you're looking at snails and slugs. If you've got a little critter that's got 4 pairs of legs, then you have an arachnid. Some common arachnids that you might know are spiders and ticks. And then you remember that in gastropod, pod means foot. So myriapod gets their name from having just so many feet. And then the last one we're going to talk about is worms. So they're called annelids. Group is complicated because a lot of times the babies of another type of insect might look like a worm. So it's a tricky group. You can't always identify if it's a worm just based on looking at it. Guys, what do you think this is? Are you thinking this is, what do you think these are? Do you think it's an alien? Do you think it's Swiss cheese? Do you think we're looking at an ocean creature or maybe a cactus? This is actually a sea urchin.
So we have another activity for everyone. Let's remember our animals again. Go back all the way to when we were talking about backbones and no backbones. Which group does everyone think is bigger? There are many more no backbone animals than there are backbone animals.
This is the jawbone of a couple different animals. We're going to look at these and try and figure out a bit more information about what animal they might have come from. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the difference between a herbivore and a carnivore. A carnivore is an animal that eats meat, and a herbivore eats plants. So these teeth are a big hint into what diet these animals might prefer. Which one of these animals do you think is a carnivore? Well, A is the carnivore. You can look a little bit more closely at that teeth structure. So you see the carnivore, the smaller of the jaws, is a lot sharper and bigger teeth. But when you look at that herbivore, you can see the teeth have been used totally different. The front teeth are super small, probably don't do a lot, but those back teeth are big and fairly sharp because they need to, their food's easy enough to pull off the ground, but they really got to grind it up in order to get all the nutrition out of that. They're tough veggies. But what else can we look at? So carnivores normally have eyes set on the front of their skull. Think about us, right on the front, because they have to focus. So if we think about that, think about the eye placement, which of these two animals now do you think is a carnivore and which is a herbivore? Animal A is the carnivore. You can see its eyes are set way more forward, whereas the other one kind of to the side so it can have a broader visual range. He's a deer. What about A? It's a bear.
So now we're going to get into some specific species trivia. See if you can guess who these species are. Our first species is an owl. Who do you think this species is? This is a barred owl. The next species, this is a goose. Our next species, this is a king crab. Okay, so you're going to see this creature in the pail. Who do you think this is? This turns into a common dronefly. Who do you think this animal is? Or these animals are?
Okay, mosquito.
Okay, so this creature kind of looks like a bird. What do you guys think? But let's think of some mammals that have really long snouts, maybe ones that live in the water. What are some mammals that live in the water? It is a mammal. This is, I believe it's a doll. Yeah, this is a Dall's porpoise. This is a similar concept. Are these guys a predator or prey? So what Jamie was talking about, this kind of relates to being either a carnivore or a herbivore. A lot of the time, if you're a predator, well, all the time, if you're a predator, you're going to be a carnivore. Some animals can be both. Some animals can hunt other animals and also be hunted themselves. Some animals only hunt other animals and don't have any predators. So when we think about some of the animals these could be, what things do we come up with? This is a moose and a mountain goat. Mountain goat and moose eat plants. They don't eat other animals, so they are prey. What about these guys? Remember, we want to think about the eyes, the teeth that Jamie mentioned. Do you think these animals eat other animals, or do you think that they are hunted themselves? So this is a bear, a coyote, a grizzly, and a lynx, all predators. So they all eat other animals, they don't eat plants, and they don't really have many natural predators themselves.
Okay, now we're going to get you guys to come up with some cool animals. So based on all that stuff you learned, so if you need help coming up with one, you don't have to do this, but one way to come up with your animal is to roll a dice. It allows you to randomize what you're going to do. So if you have a dice or if you have that little dice roller we sent out, roll the first dice. If you get an odd number, you're going to pick an invertebrate. If you get an even number, you're going to make a vertebrate. On your second roll, if you're using an invertebrate, odd number, you do an insect. Even number, do another critter. For vertebrates, here we go. 1 mammal, 2 bird, 3 amphibian, 4 reptile, 5 fish, 6 dealer's choice.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating.
And parents and adults, follow us on social media.